the entire museum staff, I just want to welcome you to this lecture by Battenfield. We are thrilled to have her work here. I had the privilege of visiting her studio last year in Brooklyn, and I already liked her work just from what I'd seen in the catalog, and then when I got to meet her and see it in person, I really fell in love with it. So it's beautiful, beautiful work, and just really brief introduction, and then I'm going to let Jackie just take it away. This is like all the facts one needs to know about everyone. She has her Bachelor's of Science from Pennsylvania State University and her Master's of Fine Arts from the College of Visual and Performing Arts in Syracuse. She is represented by Addison Ripley Fine Art in Washington, D.C., DM Contemporary in New York, and Addington Gallery in Chicago, Illinois. She has been the recipient of both the Pollock Krasner Foundation Grant in Painting and the Fulbright Scholars Program. And she's got a wonderful, wonderful presentation in which she'll tell you everything else you could possibly need to know about her and her career. She also has 2 books here, and she is available to sign them. One is a catalog from this current exhibition, and the other is her book, very, very well-received book. And if you're an artist and you've never read it, I encourage you to read it, called The Artist's Guide, How to Make a Living Doing What You Love. So, Jackie?
Thank you, Lauren. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm going to start with just a few biographical facts that I'd like you to know about myself, and then I'm going to quickly go through the relationship between my painting practice and the prints that you see here in the gallery, and how one body of work feeds the other, how they play back and forth from each other. So, this is where I live in New York City. I grew up in Pennsylvania, in western Pennsylvania, at the really outer edge of suburbia, and spent my entire childhood in fields and in the forest nearby. I sometimes think I'm an artist today because I spent so much time laying on my back in the grass and looking up at the clouds. But I always wanted to live in New York City, and as soon as I finished graduate school at Syracuse University, I moved to New York City, and I moved to this building right here. It was 1978, and New York was in a financial crisis, and there was great real estate everywhere, and if you were a young artist, you could pick up a loft for, rent it for $400 a month. Which now I teach a class at Columbia University. My Columbia students go, oh my God, it costs them $400 a day to live in New York City. So I lived in this second floor, and a lot of this work, this is where my studio was. I'm married to a painter. We are both, we both have our own painting practices. And we raised our 2 kids in this loft. And my studio was in the center. I tried to find a picture of my studio that didn't have a naked kid in it. But so you're just going to have to imagine the fact that there's this huge space, and my studio was in the middle, and we lived on the edges. So we both, my husband and myself were self-employed, and this studio was in Tribeca. And we lived only a couple blocks from Ground Zero, which later seemed kind of momentous. 4 years ago, we wanted to get a little space between us and Ground Zero, and we bought a studio and an apartment in this building in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. So I followed the artists. Tribeca really isn't much of an artist community anymore, but Williamsburg, Brooklyn is a really exciting, vibrant community. And this is an old knitting factory, which I love. It has, and what I especially love is that there's 2 feet of concrete between me and my upstairs neighbor, which is living in a really drafty old loft. And this is my studio. It's a gorgeous space. This is the studio that I get to have for the rest of my life. Another fact I'd love you to know about me is that in 1981 I started a nonprofit gallery in Brooklyn called the Rotunda Gallery, and here's kind of a crazy installation exhibition of the gallery space. And I worked for 8 years as the director of the Rotunda Gallery and curated exhibitions, and I learned an awful lot about the art world. The gallery just had its 30th anniversary this past week, and we had a great big celebration Wednesday night, which was kind of exciting. When I started it, I had no idea that 30 years that this gallery would still be functioning and going well 30 years later. Taking what I learned about the art world running this gallery, in 1989, I left the Rotunda Gallery and determined to make a living as a studio artist. And I started also at the same time teaching professional development to artists. So the other fact I'd like you to know, which Lauren already mentioned, is 2 years ago I published this book called The Artist's Guide, How to Make a Living Doing What You Love. Artists have a hard time finding mentors, finding somebody out there. An artist graduates from school and they go off to a studio and they're all by themselves. It's actually a very lonely profession, and that's why I like to do a little bit of teaching, because it gets, as much as I like the solitude of the studio, I really also need to be out amongst people. So I put all my own experiences and the teaching I've done for the last 18 years into this book, and it's really a guide for the artist, step by step, is how you think about developing a career. Not a career for just 3 years or 5 years out of school, but how do you sustain an interesting artist practice for the rest of your life? That's a challenge. I'm going to start talking about my art going way back into 1983. This is, I was 5 years out of graduate school. I was making these great big paintings. I was not doing any works on paper whatsoever, no prints. I was really interested in exploring opposites and would play with really soft poured images, stained painting with geometric abstraction. And then here I have a really, severely cropped image of a bird of paradise. It's funny, only when I was putting this lecture together that I realized how the work I'm doing today has kind of come full circle back to some of the same issues here. So these paintings, although they look like they're collage, they have really disparate elements in them, are not. They would take me anywhere from 6 to 8 months to create. I'd sit there in my studio and I'd work out one element painstakingly after the other and paint them in carefully. 1986 was a great year, and I have this image here because this was really important, my first big sale of a painting, and it was to the actor-playwright Harvey Fierstein. This painting is 6.5 feet long and 13 feet high and 13 feet long. Harvey saw my painting through a private dealer on the Upper East Side and became a really wonderful collector of my work, and made me feel like maybe there was a really interesting audience for my work. So in 1989, I left the Rotunda Gallery determined to make a living as an artist, and I was making these really big, complicated paintings. I also had a 5-year-old son and a baby. And you know what it's like having those two, that combination. You are constantly interrupted. And I was trying to develop a studio practice. And I started doing monoprints. Here's an example of me doing a really large monoprint. For those of you that don't know, monoprint is, I take a great big, in this case it's a big sheet of plexiglass, and on it I paint a painting. And then this plexiglass has a sheet of paper laid on top of it, and it goes through a printing press. And because the plexiglass is not absorbent and the paper is, the pressure from the printing press transfers the image, whatever I've painted, onto the paper. And then the printing press does a few little things on its own too, like sometimes it changes the images in unexpected ways, which I like. So in 1989, with 2 kids and being constantly interrupted and finding it really difficult to paint these very complex big paintings, I ran into a friend on the street. In fact, he was a student I had taught at Syracuse University, and I had the 5-year-old with his arms wrapped around my waist. I had the baby in the stroller. I hadn't slept in 3 years. He took one look at me, Jim took one look at me and said, "Oh, Jackie, I think you know what, I have this printing press down the street, and you know, artists come down and spend the day, you know, just working on stuff. Like, I think you need to play. And he said the word play. And I said, play. Play date. My kids go on play dates. I need a play date. So I booked a date with him. I found a babysitter. And I went to an art supply store, and I didn't know what I wanted to do with the monoprints. And so I just bought one sheet of every type of paper they had in the store, and they had all these beautiful decorative papers from Japan and Asia and Thailand and India. I bought one of all of those too. And I took this pile of papers with me to the printing press, and there on this huge slab of limestone, it was beautifully polished, I started playing. I started making these drawings without worrying about composition. I had been so focused on composition for so long. Detail here, what goes next, spending agonizing hours trying to think through a painting. Here I said, I don't care, I'm just having fun. I just poured paint, I brushed, I splattered, I gestured. And then I took all those sheets home back to the studio with me and said, so now what am I going to do with them? And I came upon an idea. I cut them all, arbitrarily, into 6-inch squares. And I was going to start collaging with these 6-inch squares. It became like a game for me. A playful game was almost like dealing out a poker hand. Looking at all these squares and figuring out how 4 of them might find themselves together. And here, I mean, I still have thousands of these squares. And so these are the first works that happened out of that. Taking these images, doing a severe cropping. What's really nice with the square is you get to turn it in all sorts of, you got lots of ways to play it. And so I started making these long horizontal pieces. I did a whole series after I found from a Japanese friend of mine that in the Japanese language, they have 36 words for the sound that water makes. Like we have one, pee-pee, right? But they have 36. I said, oh, I love a society that has 36 words about water. Here's what, and I did a whole series based on the sounds of water. It was so evocative for me to think, how do I translate this sound? This piece that you're looking at is called, it's mizu, meaning water, and hira hira. You know what that is? That's the sound of snowflakes falling. Wow. Whoa! It gives me goosebumps just to think. I want to do it again. Because of this long horizontal format, I became naturally thinking. I started thinking a lot about landscape. Thought about abstraction and gesture and nature, and abstraction tends to happen in nature during storms. So here is a tsunami. Here's another piece called Typhoon. You know, they were kind of destructive forces, but not everything was destructive. Here's one called Lago, which is lake in Italian. So I think about the subject, like how do I find the right pieces of paper that will give me a tsunami or will evoke the feeling of a typhoon, although I've never lived through one. It was all imagining. The Furies, Garden Passage. I have done 720. I just counted. They just spilled out of me. It was just a wonderful opportunity for me to get away from those kind of paintings that took forever to just really enjoying myself and like allowing my mind to be really active and to get into an active state of play and into the zone with these works. And I could do this in the middle of being constantly interrupted. I laid out big sheets of cardboard at chest height. Kids ran underneath. And I could just work on these things and pour somebody a bowl of cereal and work on these things and take it to the park and get up in the middle of the night and continue. It was fascinating.